Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to a series of videos in which I am reading you a book. We are reading Barchester Towers by Anthony Trollope, a huge hit of his. That's the story at heart, although we've been straying away from it quite a bit, of a power struggle in the cathedral town of Barchester. A new bishop has been installed at the cathedral, and he's not a member of the old Barchester ecclesiastical bureaucracy, nor is his domineering wife, nor is his slimy, manipulative, rubs-you-the-wrong-way chaplain, Mr. Slope. They're new, and they want to do things in a new way, and this causes a power struggle to occur. There are all sorts of people in Barchester who have made their entire careers as members of that bureaucracy and who don't want to see anything new. They don't want to see any changes. They especially don't want to be told that they've been wrong all this time. One of those is Mr. Harding, the saintly old warden of Hiram's Hospital that we met as a main character in the last book in this series, the previous book in this series. But the main figure in that resistance to Mr. Slope is Archdeacon Grantley, who is Mr. Harding's son-in-law. And Archdeacon Grantley is a wonderful character. He is fierce and combative. He is not at all like a churchman at all. Mr. Harding is routinely derided by every figure in this book as so saintly and weak. Even his own daughter calls him weak, when all he's really being is just a good Christian. Doesn't matter. Mr. Grantley, Dr. Grantley is not a good Christian. But he is a good warrior. And he has been coming up with forthright opinions throughout this book. Not only does he, of course, adamantly object to Mr. Slope, this figure who's not at all a gentleman. He's not at all one of our kind. He rubs everybody the wrong way. Having such power over Barchester policy, but he has also been extremely outspoken in his suspicion that his sister-in-law, Eleanor Bold, is affianced to Mr. Slope to marry him. This is a horrifying thought to her. The thought has never crossed her mind. And when she realizes that her nearest and dearest, led by Archdeacon Grantley, think this of her, she's furious with them. How could they think this about her? It causes, as we've seen in earlier chapters, a huge row at Archdeacon Grantley's house at Plumstead Episcopi. It causes a huge row. She actually has to leave in high dudgeon and doesn't really think about forgiving any of these people, even though, as we've seen, she has now achieved perfect happiness. She has now embraced Mr. Arabin, and he has embraced her. They are going to wed. They love each other. So in this section of the book, where Trollope is doing his classic falling action, where these chapters are slowly but surely wrapping up the book in a very quiet way, designed really to let us relish this wonderful story that we've been told. In these chapters, Trollope is dealing with each major physical or psychic plot element that he has raised and constructed. He's dealing with them to put them to bed. And he realizes here at the end of the book that one of those things is Archdeacon Grantley. He hasn't been in the forefront in the way that you would expect in a book of this kind, but nevertheless, he still thinks all the worst about Eleanor Bold. And he can't go on thinking that if the book is going to have a happy ending. So we now get to chapter 50, which is the Archdeacon is satisfied with the state of affairs. So let's see how he's going to see the light. The Archdeacon, in his journey into Barchester, had been assured by Mr. Harding that all their prognostications about Mr. Slope and Eleanor were groundless. Mr. Harding, however, had found it very difficult to shake his son-in-law's faith in his own acuteness. The matter had, to Dr. Grantley, been so plainly corroborated by such patent evidence, borne out by such endless circumstance, that he at first refused to take as true the positive statement which Mr. Harding had made of Eleanor's own disavowal of the impeachment. But at last he yielded in a qualified way. He brought himself to admit that he would at present regard his convictions as a mistake, but in doing this, he guarded himself that if, at any future time, Eleanor should come forth to the world as Mrs. Slope, he might still be able to say, "There, I told you so. Remember what you said and what I said, and remember also for the coming years that I was right in this matter, as in all matters." He carried, however, his concession so far as to bring himself to undertake to call at Eleanor's house. And he did call accordingly, while the father and daughter were yet in the middle of their conference. Mr. Harding had so much to hear and say that he had forgotten to advertise Eleanor of the honor that awaited her. And She heard her brother-in-law's voice in the hall while she was quite unprepared to see him. "There's the Archdeacon," she said, springing up. "Yes, my dear, he told me to tell you that he would come to see you, but to tell you the truth, I had quite forgotten about it." Eleanor fled away. Regardless of all her father's entreaties, she could not now, in the first hours of her joy, bring herself to bear all the Archdeacon's retractions, apologies, congratulations. He would have so much to say, and would be so tedious in saying it. Consequently, the Archdeacon, when he was shown into the dining room, found no one there but Mr. Harding. "You must excuse Eleanor," said Mr. Harding. "Is anything the matter?" asked the doctor, who at once anticipated that the whole truth about Mr. Slope had at last come out. "Well, something is the matter. I wonder now whether you will be much surprised." The Archdeacon saw by his father-in-law's manner that, after all, he had nothing to tell him about Mr. Slope. "No," said he, "certainly not. Nothing will ever surprise me again." Very many men nowadays, besides the Archdeacon, adopt and affect a manner of nil admirari doctrine, but nevertheless, to judge from their appearance, they are just as subject to sudden emotions as their grandmothers or grandfathers were before them. "What do you think of Mr. Arabin has done?" "Mr. Arabin? It's nothing about that daughter of Stanhope's, I hope." About the Signora, he immediately thinks of the two of them together, because rumor has spread far and wide. "Oh, no, not that woman," said Mr. Harding, enjoying his joke in his sleeve. "Not that woman. Is he going to do with anything about any other woman? Why can't you speak out if you have anything to say? There's nothing I hate so much as these sorts of mysteries." "There shall be no mystery with you, Archdeacon, though of course it must go no further at present." "Well?" "Except Susan. You must promise me you will tell no one else." "Nonsense!" exclaimed the Archdeacon, who was becoming angry in his suspense. "You can't have any secret about Mr. Arabin." "Only this, that he and Eleanor are engaged." It was quite clear to see by the Archdeacon's face that he did not believe a word of it. "Mr. Arabin? It's impossible." "Eleanor, at any rate, has just now told me so." "It's impossible," repeated the Archdeacon. "Well, I can't say that I think it's impossible. It certainly took me by surprise, but that doesn't make it impossible." "She must be mistaken." Mr. Harding assured him that there was no mistake, that he would find on returning home that Mr. Arabin had been at Plumstead with the express object of making the same declaration, that even Miss Thorne knew all about it, and that, in fact, the thing was as clearly settled as any such arrangement between a lady and a gentleman could well be. "Good heavens!" exclaimed the Archdeacon, walking up and down Eleanor's drawing room. "Good heavens! Good heavens!" Now, these exclamations certainly betokened faith. Mr. Harding properly gathered from it that, at last, Dr. Grantley did believe the fact. The first utterance clearly evinced a certain amount of distaste at the information he'd received. The second simply indicated surprise, and the tone of the third, Mr. Harding fancied that he could catch a certain gleam of satisfaction. The Archdeacon had truly expressed the workings of his mind. He could not but be disgusted to find how utterly astray he had been in all his anticipations. Had he only been lucky enough to have suggested this marriage himself when he first brought Mr. Arabin into the country, his character for judgment and wisdom would have received an addition that would have classed him at any rate next to Solomon. And why had he not done so? Might he not have foreseen that Mr. Arabin would want a wife in his parsonage? He had foreseen that Eleanor would want a husband, but should he not also have perceived that Mr. Arabin was a man much more likely to attract her than Mr. Slope? The Archdeacon found that he had been at fault, and of course could not immediately get over his discomfiture. Then his surprise was intense. How sly this pair of young turtle-doves had been with him! How egregiously they had hoaxed him! He had preached to Eleanor against her fancied attachment to Mr. Slope at the very time that she was in love with his own protege, Mr. Arabin, and had absolutely taken that same Mr. Arabin into his confidence with reference to the dread of Mr. Slope's alliance. It was very natural that the Archdeacon should feel surprise. But there was also a great ground for satisfaction. You know it's not going to be satisfaction for Eleanor. No. Looking at the match by itself, it was the very thing to help the doctor out of his difficulties. In the first place, the assurance that he should never have Mr. Slope for a brother-in-law was itself a great comfort. Then Mr. Arabin was, of all men, the one with whom it would best suit him to be so intimately connected. But the crowning comfort was the blow which this marriage would give to Mr. Slope. He had now certainly lost his wife. Rumor was beginning to whisper that he might possibly lose his position in the palace, and if Mr. Harding would only be true, the great danger would all be surmounted. In such case, it might be expected that Mr. Slope would own himself vanquished and take himself altogether away from Barchester, and so the Archdeacon would again be able to breathe pure air. "Well, well," said he. "Good heavens! Good heavens! And the tone of the fifth exclamation made Mr. Harding fully aware that content was reigning in the Archdeacon's bosom. And then, slowly, gradually, craftily, Mr. Harding propounded his own new scheme. Why should not Mr. Arabin be the new dean? Slowly, gradually, and thoughtfully, Dr. Grantley fell into his father-in-law's views. Much as he liked Mr. Arabin, sincere as was his admiration for that gentleman's ecclesiastical abilities, he would not have sanctioned a measure which would rob his father-in-law of his fairly earned promotion, were it at all practical to induce his father-in-law to accept the promotion which he had earned. But the Archdeacon had, on a former occasion, i.e. the warden, received proof of the obstinacy with which Mr. Harding could adhere to his own views in opposition to the advice of all his friends. He knew tolerably well that nothing would induce the meek, mild man before him to take the high place offered to him, if he thought it wrong to do so. Knowing this, he also said to himself more than once, why should not Mr. Arabin be Dean of Barchester? It was at last arranged between them that they would together start to London by the earliest train the following morning, making a little detour to Oxford on their journey. Dr. Gwynne's counsels, they imagined, might perhaps be of assistance to them. These matters settled, the Archdeacon hurried off, that he might return to Plumstead and prepare for his journey. The day was extremely fine, and he had come into the city in an open gig. As he was driving up the High Street, he encountered Mr. Slope at a crossing. Had he not pulled up rather sharply, he would have run him over. The two had never spoken to each other since they had met on a memorable occasion in the bishop's study. They did not speak now, but they looked each other full in the face, and Mr. Slope's countenance was as impudent, as triumphant, as defiant as ever. Had Dr. Grantley not known the contrary, he would have imagined that his enemy had won the deanship, the wife, and all the rich honors for which he had been striving. As it was, he had lost everything that he had in the world, and had just received his walking papers from the bishop. In leaving the town, the Archdeacon drove by the well-remembered entrance of Hiram's Hospital. There, at the gate, was a large, untidy farmer's wagon, laden with untidy-looking furniture, and there, inspecting the arrival, was good Mrs. Quiverful, not dressed in her Sunday best, not very clean in her apparel, not graceful as to her bonnet and shawl, or indeed with many feminine charms as to her whole appearance. She was busy at domestic work in her new house, and had just ventured out, expecting to see no one on the arrival of the family chattels. The Archdeacon was down upon her before she knew where she was. Her acquaintance with Dr. Grantley or his family was very slight indeed. The Archdeacon, as a matter of course, knew every clergyman in the Archdeaconry. It may almost be said that he knew every clergyman in the diocese, and had some acquaintance more or less intimate with their wives and families. With Mr. Quiverful he had been concerned on various matters of business, but with Mrs. Q he had seen very little. Now, however, he was in too gracious a mood to pass her by unnoticed. The Quiverfuls, one and all, had looked for the bitterest hostility from Dr. Grantley. They knew his anxiety that Mr. Harding should return to his old home at the hospital, and they did not know that a new home had been offered to him at the deanery. Mrs. Quiverful was therefore not a little surprised, and not a little rejoiced also at the tone in which she was addressed. "How do you do, Mrs. Quiverful? How do you do?" said he, stretching his left hand out of the gig as he spoke to her. "I'm very glad to see you so employed in so pleasant and useful a manner. Very glad indeed." Mrs. Quiverful thanked him and shook hands with him and looked into his face suspiciously. She was not sure whether the congratulations and kindness were or were not ironical. "Pray tell Mr. Quiverful from me," he continued, "that I am rejoiced at his appointment. It is a very comfortable place, Mrs. Quiverful, and a comfortable house, and I am very glad to see you in it. Goodbye. Goodbye now." And he drove on, leaving the lady well pleased and astonished at his good nature. On the whole, things were going well with the Archdeacon, and he could afford to be charitable to Mrs. Quiverful. He looked forth from his gig smilingly on all the world, and forgave everyone in Barchester their sins except only Mrs. Proudie and Mr. Slope. Had he seen the bishop, he would have felt inclined to pat even his kindly on the head. He determined to go home by St. Ewald's. This would take him some 3 miles out of his way, but he felt that he could not leave Plumstead comfortably without saying one word of good fellowship to Mr. Arabin. When he reached the parsonage, the vicar was still out, but from what he had heard, he had no doubt that he would meet him on the road between their two houses. He was right in this, for about halfway home, at a narrow turn, he came upon Mr. Arabin, who was on horseback. "Well, well, well, well," said the Archdeacon, loudly, joyously, and with supreme good humor. "Well, well, well, well. So, after all, we have no further cause to fear Mr. Slope." "I hear from Mrs. Grantley that they have offered the deanery to Mr. Harding," said the other. "Mr. Slope has lost more than the deanery, I find." And then the Archdeacon laughed jocosely. Come, Arabin, you have kept your secret well enough. I know all about it now." "I have had no secret, Archdeacon," said the other with a quiet smile. "None at all, not for a day. It was only yesterday that I knew my own good fortune, and today I went over to Plumstead to ask your approval. From what Mrs. Grantley has said to me, I am led to hope that I shall have it." With all my heart," said the Archdeacon cordially, holding his friend fast by the hand. "It's just as I would have it. She's an excellent young woman. She will not come to you empty-handed, and I think she will make a good wife. If she does her duty by you as her sister does by me, you'll be a happy man. That's all I can say." And as he finished speaking, a tear might have been observed in each of the Archdeacon's eyes. Mr. Arabin warmly returned the Archdeacon's grasp, but he said little. His heart was too full for speaking, and he could not express the gratitude which he felt. Dr. Grantley understood him as well as though he had spoken for an hour. "And mind, Arabin," he said, "no one but myself shall tie the knot. We'll get Eleanor out to Plumstead, and it shall come off there. I'll make Susan stir herself, and we'll do it in style. I must be off to London tomorrow on special business. Harding goes with me, but I'll be back before your bride has got her wedding dress ready." And so they parted. He's not saying his errand in London. He's keeping that to himself. On his journey home, the Archdeacon occupied his mind with preparations for the marriage festivities. He made a great resolve that he would atone to Eleanor for all the injury he had done to her by the munificence of his future treatment. He would show her what was the difference in his eyes between a Slope and an Arabin. On one other thing also he decided with a firm mind. If the affair of the Dean should not be settled in Mr. Arabin's favour, nothing would prevent him from putting a new front bow window to the dining room at St. Ewold's parsonage. "So we're sold after all, Sue," he said to his wife, accosting her with a kiss as soon as he entered the house. He did not call his wife Sue above twice or thrice a year, and these occasions were great high days. "Eleanor has more sense than we gave her credit for," said Mrs. Grantley. And there was great content in Plumstead Rectory that evening, and Mrs. Grantley promised her husband that she would now open her heart and take Mr. Arabin into it. Hitherto she had declined to do so. So that is chapter 50 of Barchester Towers. Archdeacon Grantley has been satisfied in all things. The only thing he kicks himself about is that he wished he'd played matchmaker. He wished he'd seen it to play matchmaker. Something that, I might add, any reader of this book could have done as soon as Mr. Arabin is introduced. As soon as he comes on the scene, it's easy to see. In retrospect, maybe. Archdeacon Grantley was so consumed with the thoughts of warfare that he did not see it. But that is chapter 50. We will move on. We have just 2 installments of this book. Ordinarily, there's one final chapter and then a conclusion. And the conclusion isn't long, and it's perfunctory even for Trollope. We'll read it because it's so glowing. It's so twilighty. Not the book, but the time of day. So it's such an envoy. But ordinarily, I would lump them together, but nothing on earth would propel me to dilute the joys of the next chapter. Nothing on earth would. So we're going to get the next chapter all by its lonesome. It's the chapter that you and I have all been waiting for. So I'll wrap this up for now, and I will read that to you next time. Thank you, BookTube.